Hello! Now you might be wondering what the connection between Medieval and surface tension, this being J Gunn and this being Jason Wilson, have. Well, J Gunn is only my pen name that I use for writing and drawing comic books, the first of which was Surface Tension, which was released as a book this year. It's a science fiction, horror, eco-fantasy, and if you like Medieval, you might like this. It's full of lots of crazy, weird creatures and environments. But this week saw the 18th anniversary of the release of Medieval. So 18 years has flown by, and the game is still fondly remembered by gamers. And I thought we'd take a look at some notebooks that I recently discovered a few weeks ago when I was tidying up my studio. This little book being the thing that I recently found, and I had a nostalgic look back at all my notes and reviews based on playing the game before it was finished and released. And I thought I'd dig out all my old concept art books and take a look back at the development of Medieval through my drawings. So here we go. So these great big tomes contain most, if not all, of the artwork for the first Medieval game released on the PlayStation by Sony. And what would happen is when a game is finished and the PR is over with and there's no more need for the game design materials, most of this stuff is usually thrown away, like literally thrown into skips and disposed of. And over the past few decades I've managed to save a lot of artwork from being destroyed. And once when I left Sony, people would even email me saying, "Oh, there's some artwork in a bin, do you want it?" And being a bit of a geek and an aficionado of the background of movies, comics, video games, I'm a sucker for looking at all that material, so I wanted to keep a lot of this for myself, because I knew there was fans of the game and it's always nice to have a look at. So these books contain a lot of the drawings and the designs, maps and scripts from the original game. So a lot of this stuff is about 19-20 years old. And as you can see in this document here, if I bring this closer to the camera, this is one of the very early design documents. And so the date for this thing is specification for 3D action adventure game by Chris Sorrell. Chris was the creative director of the game. 21st December 1995, version 2.2. And I was the first person to join Chris on Medieval back in 1995. And my job was to create an art style for the game and help with the game design before other team members joined the project. And you might notice it did say Millennium Interactive. That's because at that point, at the beginning of the development of Medieval, we were not yet owned by Sony. In the old days of development, before the big corporates joined the industry, such as Sony and Microsoft, games were released by small publishers, but in order to offset their costs, they usually tried to find investment and sponsorship. So a lot of games from Millennium would feature advertising from confectionery companies, and you would see things like Penguin biscuits and wagon wheels on the loading screens for the games. And Sony were shown a early demo of Medieval and were so impressed by it that they wanted to own the IP for the game and bought the actual studio. So Millennium Interactive became the Sony Cambridge studio. So the studio was based and founded on buying Medieval. So that's how it all started in that studio. And this would have been a very early presentation put together by Chris. I think this one was potentially for Sony, because it's got some of the old rendered images created by Jason Riley in this presentation, so it certainly wasn't one of the first, but it would have been an early demonstration presentation. And you can see here the style, the background story, and the sort of the visual ideas behind the game, and some of the drawings that I did for this here. And when we were making Medieval, everything was very, very, very hand to mouth, and everything was very primitive in terms of the materials that we're using. So a lot of it wouldn't be drawn and created in things like Photoshop, like today's artwork is. A lot of it was drawn on paper with crayons and pencils, and all the tools we used were very, very simple. So this is well before things like mind map software and all the other engines that we use these days. Everything was basically made from scratch. So it was almost like arts and crafts. Even this presentation was printed onto sheets of acetate, as you can see here, and this would have been projected on an old-fashioned, almost like a 1970s style projector, projected onto the wall from a light source. So we didn't have things like PowerPoint connected to a PC, so an example of how primitive things would be. And so just flick through that, and I'll jump to another book full of artwork. Oh, there's an abandoned level design. There's lots of these kind of things go on in a game's development cycle. You just throw lots of ideas at the wall and see what sticks, and inevitably things are cut out. And as you can see, some of the drawing style was very, very childlike. It's almost like from a children's picture book, and it was the sort of style we were aiming for with the game. It was a very early console development, so we didn't have that many polygons to throw around the screen, so the drawings were very simple to reflect the simplistic nature of game design at that time. It's not to say we were not ambitious, as you will see. So this is another book that contains lots of drawings and notes. So this drawing here was one of the first ever drawings that I think I did for Medieval. Again, it was a crayon drawing, pencils. And it was just to basically show this is what the game will look like overall. So the camera is behind the main character, Dan Fortescue, the skeletal knight, and the camera is going to be pushing forward as the scenery moves around. And I think at this point the game was on rails, so it wasn't the kind of the free-form, vaguely sandbox world that ended up in the final game in terms of the levels. It was very on rails. It was very much a traditional hack and slash game. I think Chris's idea was to make it a 3D Ghosts and Goblins. The adventure-y storyline aspects were added much later in the development cycle. So this would have been one of the first ever drawings for the game. And these drawings you can see here, this would have been just to establish the sort of like the quirky angles we wanted to capture in the game, the sort of Tim Burton-esque element, very much inspired by Nightmare Before Christmas. You know, very, very colourful art style. Again, these were all crayon drawings. And in the early days of the game's development cycle, we were going to have levels of the game that some were fixed angles looking down, and some were fixed angles sort of going left to right. So it was a very rigid camera system. Again, we developed a much more free-form camera and game style of play as we progressed and became more and more confident in terms of the technology and the game design. But these would have been very early drawings to establish the sort of the scenery and the style of the game at that moment in time. And also, we didn't even know we were going to develop it on the PlayStation for the first 6 or so months of development. So we were looking at basing PC or basing it on the Sega console that was out at the time. So part of my job would be to analyse the technology of those consoles or other platforms and see how we could create geometry and level design ideas based on the limitations or the scope of the technology that we'd be looking at. So I think these were for actually the Sega console at the time, which didn't have that many polygons to throw around. So these were ideas of how we could kind of exploit the technology and how we could create this kind of quirky looking environments with very little in the way of grunt power. And these would have been just like atmospheric drawings just to get across the tone and the colours and the environment. Again, very, very simple drawings, but they really kind of got the point across. Again, full of early drawings of the sort of environment style, crooked angles. And I did lots of drawings of environments which were not full game design maps, they would come later. These were like very small encapsulations of the level. So this was the Pumpkin Gorge. So it isn't actually a gameplay walkthrough. It's just a level design that shows the primary features of a level and the sort of things we would try and seed in throughout a level as the game flowed through various paths through an environment. So these were just to establish the tone of a level. Jumping over here, this is interesting. Because 3D graphics were quite basic in those days, everything was poly based. We didn't really have splines or anything like we see now, and we didn't really have we had none of the shaders and techniques of today's 3D software for showing creating environments. So we had this thing called per-face mapping. So each square or polygon would have a texture applied to it, and that was it. It was a flat texture. So what I would do is I would draw environments, literally draw the polygons of a piece of environment. With my coloured crayons, I would colour in each of the polys, which would show how the textures would actually piece together like a jigsaw. So you can see that's a polygon, and all these things. I would literally draw areas of the level and doodle in the actual textures. and then I would create the textures digitally in a very early version of Photoshop. I think the lion's share of the texture work was done by myself, and with a helping hand of Jason Riley on a few levels. You can see here an abandoned concept for Dan on what we call the dragon boat, travelling down a river. And wherever possible I would add technical details of how I thought we could do visuals. Again, things were very simple in those days. One person could do a huge amount of work, so here I'm demonstrating a flat field of polygons, transparent, with little sprite fish or simple 3D models flowing through the level. So again, really simple. It was really fun days because you could do a lot yourself. So there's lots and lots of scraps of paper in here. All this stuff would go into the game. Don't know what's in here. I haven't looked at this for years. I think I collected art that belonged to other people as well that might have been thrown away. This is a little watercolour drawing created by Jason Riley for the intro sequence to the game, Zarok's Lair. It's a really nice little drawing. Probably some PR material. It's just the final render of one of the rendered sequence in the game. The mount. I think that was the Halls of Madness. I can't remember the name of it. And again, we do these kind of like splashy art images just to get across like impact, even though it would never look like that in the game. There's no way we could do anything like that in those days. Various creatures. And I might also create animation drawings. Excuse me. Let's drink some water. So this is just to show how characters might animate and move through a level. So this is the Fat Knights, and they would belly barge you, so it's just to get the idea across. And yeah, so lots and lots and lots of very colourful, cartoony drawings. This was drawings for an abandoned level. We end up with lots of cut elements in a game. This was a section where, because Dan's an undead character, and he has one eye, and in the other eye lives this little worm, and we're going to have a level where you could take the worm out and pop it through a keyhole in a door, and then the worm would wriggle through the level. So things that were very small in environments can become colossal obstacles to traverse. That would have been a fun idea, but it was just too much. And more drawings of lots of zombies and things. Very easy comics inspired sort of zombies. Gargoyles and things. And over here we have level designs, and again they were all done on paper, and I would map out a level and write on these level maps where enemies would spawn, where all the objects are, where all the collision volumes are for activating certain enemies, and where all the puzzles would be placed. So everything was specced out on paper by hand. And then the designers and the programmers would then implement this in game. So, yeah, you can just see it's like a huge amount of hand-written and hand-drawn level designs. And this thing, all these papers would have been blue-tacked to the walls of the studio, and we would all gather around these drawings and discuss them. And we didn't really have much in the way of producers in those days. We kind of almost produced ourselves. I'm surprised we did as much as we could without any of the techniques and practices that were brought into the studio in later years by Sony. It's kind of ironic that we were a very young team. I think the average age was 22, 23. None of us had really made a game of this scale before. And a lot of people had come straight from school or even university. But most of the team was back bedroom programmers from the 1980s making their own little games, and we all came together to make this bigger game. And 3D technology was very embryonic at the time of making of this game. Like Mario 64 and Tomb Raider hadn't yet been released, so we had no real guidelines or no real path to actually use as a blueprint. I mean, when you make a game nowadays, there's just so many other games that are similar that you can use as a blueprint. But yeah, in terms of camera, getting 3D graphics on screen, animation, everything was new. So we were like very pioneering, and yeah, we had a huge amount of enthusiasm to make this game as good as we could, and a lot of naive optimism. again, countless little hand drawings. And I'd always try and draw things in a polygonal fashion, so I wouldn't over detail things. So when artists did have to build the environment, I'd almost done a lot of the work up front, which enabled them to faithfully transfer those graphics onto screen. And one of my Bibles, in terms of reference for Medieval, was this book, film. Let me see that there. Film Architecture, and I think it's out of print now. But it was like such a great source of inspiration, and it's a book mostly concentrating on old film set designs, and especially of the special interest was German Expressionism, which is where Tim Burton took a lot of his influence, was from the early cinema of German films, things like Dr. Caligari and films by Murnau and Nosferatu and so on. So you can see Dr. Caligari here is very similar to what we ended up with in Medieval, and I would try and copy this style to use it as a style guide for Medieval. As you can see, some of the drawings I showed were kind of almost similar styles to this, and they're almost like very polygonal shaped structures, very straight lines, which is very handy for our primitive technology at the time to kind of capture those kooky angles. Again, you can see the sort of Tim Burton Batman-esque inspiration of something like Caligari, which I drew on for Medieval as well. So yeah, I really highly recommend seeking out this book if you're interested in film set design production as an artist. And one thing I like about really old movies is that they feel quite fresh today, because they're using techniques that almost seem experimental now, even though at the time they were hand to mouth in terms of filmmaking. And it was the same with when we were making games. When we were making something like Medieval, in terms of film history, we were almost in this era, the silent film era, and things have massively progressed in the 18-20 years since Medieval came out, and we can do so much more. But I do miss the really fun, experimental, we don't know what we're doing attitude of something like a Medieval, and we hugely enjoyed the experience. And yeah, so thanks for enjoying the game and still talking about it all these years later. So yeah, wish you all the best, and bye.